Join us for the Criterion Institute Podcast as Joy Anderson, a global thought leader in business and social change, leads us through a series of discussions, interviews, frameworks, rants, and reframes that will help you better understand how to use finance as a tool for transformative systems change.
I am Joy Anderson, and this is the Criterion Institute Podcast. From the founding of Criterion 25 years ago to today, one of the core design elements in how we built the organization was to have it enable access. And so folks who wanted to explore systems of finance and had never been part of that could show up at Criterion and be able to have access that they wouldn't normally have. The reality is that often translated into volunteer roles. We couldn't honestly pay everybody who was going to show up or who wanted to show up. And we actually didn't want whether or not people were being paid to be a constraint. And in a lot of work around gender and inequities, we name the dynamics around unpaid labor, who gets paid, which is a really important point. But the flip side of that is the importance of volunteerism in civic activity in ways that showing up, not because you're in a contractual relationship with somebody, not because they're paying for your labor, but because you want to have a voice, because you want to have access. And so this question of voluntary association has been a question in the intellectual and organizational work that I've done for most of my life, actually. It was a core part of my dissertation in American history, looking at the history of voluntary associations. Tocqueville wrote a classic piece about the role of volunteer associations in the development of an American democracy. So for good or for bad, it's been a part of how we engage. It's been a part of how we created a space that is not government. It is not the private sector. It's not businesses. It's a space where citizens, human beings, can come together and act. And in an interesting way, volunteerism, voluntary activity, doesn't require permission. And that shifts power dynamics. Enjoy. Voluntary associations have played a key role in American history in how civil society was formed, particularly in the early 19th century. This was a time where government was still forming. How it was going to operate as a republic was not yet clear. Organized religion was seen as part of the problem. There were lots of challenges to the hierarchy and the power structures that existed within classical religious structures. And so what emerged were a set of voluntary associations, and they actually proliferated significantly in the early 19th century. There was sort of an abundance of folks coming together and writing a charter and becoming a voluntary association. This guy, Robert Vaux, is sort of well known for being good at writing the charter of a voluntary association. I think he founded something like 7 or 8 of them. Anyway, I know all of this because I studied voluntary associations as part of my dissertation, which was on 19th century prison reform. Okay, I'm going to get to a point here someplace. So I looked at 2 societies. One was the Boston Prison Discipline Society, but I actually focused on the one that was countering the Boston Prison Discipline Society, known as the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. All right, so you have these voluntary associations that were a place where people could self-organize to have a voice, to take action, to organize. And so from the very beginning, this idea, the sort of beginning of the Republic, this idea of voluntary associations as part of how we shaped power dynamics within a republic was critical. And this actually continued. You ended up with many of the social reform movements being driven by voluntary associations, temperance movement, women's suffrage, the abolitionist movement, and some of the biggest charitable organizations within the United States were voluntary associations, YMCA, Salvation Army, American Red Cross eventually. And so this idea that you could come together as associating freely, right, that you could join, and that's sort of a classic idea in a sort of American mythology, that there's this freedom of association, that we can come together and do things. So that whole movement then encountered a historical shift, lots of reasons behind this, of professionalization. And so many of the charitable organizations professionalized, right? At some point, the YMCA or YWCA were actually almost completely volunteer organizations. They are today well-staffed, massive organizations, still with an element of volunteerism to them, but largely being driven by a paid team. In fact, you'll see most nonprofits moved into becoming a paid organization. It was paid work, the sort of nonprofit industrial complex, so to speak, that emerged where people got paid to do charitable work was a relatively recent phenomenon. So it's not until the early 20th century where professionalism versus voluntarism begins to take hold, and that took some time. It wasn't an automatic sort of dominance of professionalism. So here's the next piece, because professionalism has all kinds of good aspects to it, right? You have the ability to actually have expertise that gets trained for, certifications, training, so that you're not just a volunteer showing up and being able to do what you want, but rather there's an expertise attached to that, so that if you wanted to be able to provide social service, you should know how to provide social service. You should have training in being a social servant, so to speak. And so all of that has some good aspects, but it also created a barrier. It meant that you couldn't actually simply show up and volunteer. And so there ends up being, in many parts of our world, a kind of distrust of volunteerism. I hear it come up sometimes in my world, sort of naming that if you're not paid, then your work's not valued. And so that you shouldn't want to volunteer, because if you volunteered, then it's showing that you're willing to work for free, and you're undervaluing either because you're a woman and you're volunteering and therefore your labor is less important, or the role itself is seen as a volunteer role, and since it's not paid, it's not important. And I do think there's just an interesting shift here, right? Which is being paid is what defines its importance. And I'm not saying that it shouldn't. This is sort of realpolitik of the world, that sort of who's paid and who's paid well has more power. But it does create a barrier of access of saying, well, what if I didn't have to be paid? Because in fact, there is a part of our world, there's a part of our social life, there's a part of our community life that is not all about paid work. And what gets counted as paid work, what is counted as unpaid work, have a ton of social constructions attached to them. A topic for another day. But I want to zero in on this idea of access. This sort of voluntarism leads to association and access. I'm a member of a small church. I am an active volunteer in my small church. I do all kinds of stuff. In fact, I run the rota, which is the thing that organizes all of the other volunteers and says who's supposed to show up and do what thing on what day, so that we can literally have dozens of volunteers who actually get the day-to-day life of the church done. And one of the things I love about this is it decreases our reliance on a kind of professional structure. While our priest is a nice person, I'm quite fond of her actually, but while she's important, it's clear that what's really important is the congregation, the group of people who are working together. And in that world, I feel a kind of privilege of volunteerism, a sense that what we get done is because we're volunteers, and that volunteerism is in some ways privileged over those who are paid. Okay, maybe that's not completely true. In the end, the priest has the final say on all kinds of governance stuff, but there is a way that we come together as volunteers. And I see this in Criterion. One of my values in leading Criterion has been to keep it as a porous organization, so that if people want to come and hang out, we are not guaranteeing that we will pay everybody who wants to come and hang out, but you are free to come and hang out. You are free to associate. You are free to be part of something, whether or not you need to be paid to be part of it. Now, again, I'm really aware that there's a privilege that's attached to whether or not people have the freedom to volunteer. But I'd rather not oversimplify that, because many parts of our world are driven actually by much more informal economies that are not all about who gets paid what and what structure they play in what organization. In fact, the informality of it is what's important. In the center of this is a principle that says, I don't have to be paid, and I don't necessarily have to be chosen or appointed to be able to associate. And I believe that is an important thing to continue. That we have this freedom of association that is not driven solely by the jobs that are paid. That in fact, that freedom of voluntary association, how we come together to shape things, plays a critical function, and we should honor it. One of the things that I am proud of is the number of people who call themselves home at Criterion because they volunteer. We've had people volunteer for upwards of a decade as part of Criterion, doing work day to day. And in some ways, this is our friends and allies, right, who are doing all kinds of work together, not necessarily for Criterion, but as a form of coming together in a form of voluntary association. And there is a power to that. Voluntary associations is one form of access. The ability to show up and be part of something, and by being part of something, learn about it. And in learning about it, connect with others and become part of an organization, part of a community, have a formal role, even in an informal structure. I think we discount these too often. We consider volunteers as less than or not good enough to get paid. But it is simply another form of association, a way of coming together, being a community, figuring out how we do things, learning how to do things together. One of the things I love about being a member of a church, actually, is leaving aside all the religious stuff, but there's something about knowing where the forks are in the kitchen that is really the moment where I feel like I belong. That somebody shows up and comes to coffee hour and wants to know, where are the knives stored? Do we have different cups? The simple questions. And that ability to welcome somebody, the ability to say, sure, I know where the knives are. They're right here, and you're free to use them, is one of my favorite kinds of welcoming. It's not a professional expertise, but it's the ability to have said, because I'm here, because I come to this place, because I'm part of this community, I know how things work, and therefore I can welcome you. So in this process of creating porous organizations, of creating ways that we can do work together, ways that we can associate and create things together, there needs to always be a space for those who organize other volunteers, who organize people to work together in different ways, to be together in different ways, and have that be about our choice, not about the choice of the person who pays us, but about our choice to show up or walk away, and to build something, even if nobody's paying us to build it. Just because we weren't paid to do it doesn't mean what we did isn't valuable. In fact, the things that we build outside of our formal professional lives, our families, our communities, our civic society, might actually be the thing that sustains us.
For over 20 years, Criterion has been shaped by the people who showed up, curious, committed, and willing to learn how finance can be used to shift systems and advance gender equality. There's more than one way to work with us, and we've created volunteer opportunities for different types of contributors. One way is through the Criterion Fellowship. The Criterion Fellowship is a structured voluntary program that offers deep learning, access to our tools and frameworks, and the opportunity to contribute to real, meaningful work alongside of our team. The value is real. Learning how systems change actually happens, access to people and ideas shaping the field, and the chance to help more people see finance as a tool that they can use. If you don't know us already, your first step is to start showing up at our events. Our events are interactive learning spaces where you can join in conversations and contribute where your curiosity and capacity align. We believe in porous boundaries. People come closer for a season, step away for a time, and return in new ways. Some want structure and immersion. Others want to engage more informally. All of it matters. We work to expand what is seen as possible for using finance as a tool for social change. We would love to work together with you. If you're drawn to the work, come learn with us. Come contribute, come be part of the work that matters.
To learn more about our work, visit us at criterioninstitute.org. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Your reviews help our podcast reach a wider audience. Thanks for listening.